My husband, Samuel, raised my 3 kids since they were 5 and even lost his legs, pushing Katie out of the way of a drunk driver. But when he got out of the hospital in a wheelchair, our kids stopped visiting him. 2 months later, I found them having Father's Day dinner with their biological father who'd just been released from federal prison after 20 years. When they showed up next Sunday, asking Samuel for money while calling him pathetic and making fun of his wheelchair in their group chat, I decided they needed to learn who their real father was. My husband Samuel may as well have been my children's dad. He raised them since they were 5. He nursed every scraped knee, paid every club fee, played dress up with my youngest, and worked 70-hour weeks during every birthday season. He even studied Japanese to connect more with Lila while she was going through her K-pop phase. He never asked for anything until now. He had just been checked out of the hospital where he was told he would never walk again. Our kids promised him they'd visit. Our oldest Joshua sent thumbs up emojis to every request. Yeah, Dad, for sure this weekend. Lila kept saying med school was crushing her, but she'd definitely make time soon. Katie, my baby, the one Samuel pushed out of the way when that drunk driver hit them, she came once, but only for 20 minutes. Spent it scrolling TikTok while he tried to show her how the wheelchair worked. 2 months passed, nothing. I watched him set the table every Sunday, losing hope they'd show up with each passing week. Him and I would eat alone by 7 p.m. and he'd pretend it was okay, but I could tell it crushed him. He'd pack up the leftovers, label them with their names, text them that food was in the fridge. No worries if you couldn't make it next week. Then I saw it on Facebook, all 3 of them, having dinner with their biological father, the man who abandoned us 2 decades ago for a meth lab that landed him in federal prison. Joshua posted about reconnecting with their roots. Lila shared quotes about blood being thicker than water. Katie just posted selfies with him. When Father's Day came, Samuel woke up at 6 a.m., showered himself, which takes him an hour now, and put on the cologne Katie bought him 3 years ago. He made reservations at that place Joshua loves. He texted in the family group chat where everyone promised they would be there. We arrived 5 minutes late, but nobody was there yet. By 1 hour in, I begged Samuel to just go, but he wouldn't. He kept saying they'd be here any minute now, clearly fooling himself. We only left 2 hours in. When we got home, he checked his phone again, and that's when we saw it. Their Instagram stories. Best Father's Day ever, with Travis, their bio dad, at some steakhouse downtown. Joshua's caption said, "Finally complete again." I swear to God I heard something break inside Samuel's chest. The next Sunday I called them and reamed them a new one. Told them they better come over today or I'm personally gonna snap. They listened to me. But when they showed up for dinner, they acted like nothing happened. Even worse, instead of asking anything about Dad, they kept talking about Travis's prison stories, how misunderstood he was, how the system failed him. Samuel finally asked, his voice small, "Did I do something wrong? Why won't you visit me anymore?" Lila actually rolled her eyes. "God, Samuel, we're adults. We don't need you hovering." Joshua shrugged. "Besides, our real dad is back now. We need that relationship too." Real dad. The words hung there like a knife in the air. Samuel just nodded, smiled, served dinner. 2 weeks later, the texts came in, all at the same time. Joshua needed $5,000 for urgent car repairs. Lila needed $8,000 for MCAT prep. Katie wanted $3,000 for a Cabo spring break trip when it was autumn. Samuel texted back telling them to come for Sunday dinner, saying he'd have their checks ready. When they slouched in, they didn't even look at him, just whispered about how slow he was moving now, laughed about something Travis had said about cripples milking sympathy. I know they didn't think I heard that part. Samuel wheeled over with 3 envelopes, and they ripped them open like it was Christmas morning. But what they found inside was only $1 each. Their faces went from greedy to confused to furious in about 3 seconds. They turned to Samuel and, "What the fuck? Sit down, all of you." I stood up and slammed my hands on the table. They actually looked shocked that I was speaking. "Mom, you can't be serious. We're your actual kids." I laughed. "My actual kids? You want to talk about actual? I actually chose dope over feeding you. I actually left you in dirty diapers for days. I actually brought men home who scared you so bad you'd hide in closets. Your dad was one of those men." Katie started to speak, but I wasn't done. "I was a failure, but Samuel raised you. He actually taught Joshua to drive, actually held Lila's hair during her bulimic phase, actually lost his legs saving Katie from a drunk driver." I pulled out my phone, showed them their group chat, making fun of his wheelchair, calling him pathetic, planning to milk him for money to give to Travis. Joshua went white. "You went through our phones?" "No, you idiots backed up to the family cloud, the one Samuel set up and pays for." I walked to the door, opened it. "You know what your real dad asked you for money for? His dealer." "Yeah, I know about that too. And you were going to take it from the man who destroyed his body raising you." My voice cracked more. "Samuel hasn't been able to feel his legs for 4 months. He cries during physical therapy, not from pain, from watching videos of Katie's dance recitals, knowing he'll never walk her down the aisle." They started protesting about tuition, rent, life. "Cancel it all, Samuel," I said. He nodded, pulled out his laptop. "Already done. You have 30 days before you're dropped from your schools. Your father can handle it now. The real one, right?" They all looked at us like we were in the wrong. They stormed out, telling us this wasn't over. Their real dad wouldn't put up with this. The next morning, I was making coffee when the doorbell rang 3 times fast. Then someone started pounding on the door. Samuel wheeled himself toward the hallway, but I got there first and looked through the peephole. Travis stood there with all 3 kids behind him. He was wearing a tank top that showed his prison tattoos and kept cracking his knuckles. I opened the door and he pushed past me into our living room without asking. The kids followed him in and wouldn't look at us. Travis walked around our house like he owned it, picking up Samuel's medical bills from the coffee table and looking at them. Samuel wheeled into the room and Travis stood right over him, using his height to make Samuel look up at him. Travis started yelling about how we were keeping money from his kids, and he'd sue us for emotional distress if we didn't fix this right now. His spit was hitting Samuel's face. I grabbed my phone and called our family lawyer while Travis kept ranting about parental alienation and how judges always side with bio parents. Samuel pulled out his phone and started recording from his wheelchair while Travis paced around screaming about his rights. Joshua and Lila stood by the door staring at their phones. Katie sat on our couch scrolling TikTok. None of them would make eye contact with us. Travis grabbed the handles of Samuel's wheelchair and started shaking it hard while screaming about the money they deserved. Samuel's head was snapping back and forth and his hands gripped the armrests. That's when Joshua finally spoke up, but not to help Samuel. He told Travis we had a savings account at Wells Fargo with over $80,000 in it. My whole body went cold. Travis let go of the wheelchair and smiled at Joshua like he was proud of him. He said we had 24 hours to transfer half that money or he'd see us in court. Then he walked out out, and the kids followed him without saying a word to us. After the door slammed, Samuel started crying harder than I'd ever seen him cry. Not angry tears, but these deep broken sobs that shook his whole body. He kept asking me what he did wrong over and over. I held him while he shook and reminded him his physical therapy was in an hour, but he couldn't stop crying long enough to get ready. We barely made it to the appointment. 3 days later at physical therapy, Marcus noticed Samuel wasn't doing his exercises right. Samuel's hands were shaking, and he kept stopping to wipe his eyes. Marcus asked what was wrong, and Samuel tried to explain but kept breaking down. Marcus canceled his next appointment and just sat there listening while Samuel told him everything. Later that day, our bank called saying someone tried to access our accounts using Samuel's information. The attempt failed because they didn't have the security questions right, but the bank recommended we change everything immediately. Samuel realized the kids knew his passwords from years of him trusting them with everything. We spent 3 hours at the bank changing all our account information. Katie posted a TikTok that afternoon about toxic parents who use money to control their adult children. It got 50,000 views in 2 hours. Our neighbor showed it to me at the grocery store asking if everything was okay with our family. Samuel saw it when his coworker texted him the link with a question mark. The video showed Katie crying about how we cut them off for choosing their real father. She never mentioned the wheelchair or the money requests or calling Samuel pathetic. A week later, a process server showed up while Samuel was trying to make lunch. His hands were shaking so bad he kept dropping the peanut butter jar. The server handed him papers and left. Travis had filed an actual lawsuit claiming we were withholding money that rightfully belonged to the children for their education and well-being. Samuel's hands shook worse as he read it. That night, I couldn't sleep and went to get water at 3 in the morning. I found Samuel in the living room surrounded by photo albums. He had pictures spread across his lap of birthday parties and graduations and Katie's dance recitals. He was pulling out every photo with him in it and putting them in a separate pile. He said he didn't want to ruin their memories by being in them. I tried to take the photos away, but he held on to them crying again. The next day, our lawyer looked at Travis's lawsuit and actually laughed out loud. Travis showing up and shaking Samuel's wheelchair while demanding money? That's quite the power play from someone who just got out of prison. I wonder if the kids really didn't see how wrong that was, or if they're just too caught up in reconnecting with their bio dad to care about Samuel getting physically intimidated in his own home. She said it was complete legal nonsense with no basis in law. But then she got serious and warned us the kids could testify against us about emotional abuse if Travis coached them on what to say. Samuel went completely pale and asked if they would really do that. The lawyer said she'd seen worse from kids who wanted money. 3 days later, Samuel's doctor's office called while I was making breakfast. The office manager said someone claiming to be me just tried to get Samuel's medical records over the phone. She recognized Lila's voice from all the times she'd brought Samuel to appointments before the accident. The manager said Lila kept insisting Samuel was faking his paralysis for attention and demanded proof of his real condition. I dropped the spatula and eggs burned while I stood there shaking. Samuel wheeled himself into the kitchen and saw my face, but I couldn't tell him what his daughter just did. 2 weeks passed with nothing but lawyer meetings and paperwork. Then at 2 a.m., our doorbell rang over and over until I stumbled downstairs. Joshua stood there swaying and reeking of whiskey. He pushed past me into the living room and collapsed on the couch crying about how Travis had something on all 3 of them. Before I could ask what he meant, he was already stumbling back out the door. Samuel had heard everything from upstairs but just stared at the ceiling when I came back to bed. The next week, Samuel insisted we go to Katie's college dance showcase, even though she hadn't invited us. We drove 2 hours and found the auditorium packed with parents holding flowers. Our reserved seats from last year were taken, and when we asked an usher for help, Katie appeared. She told security we were stalkers who'd been harassing her and pointed at Samuel's wheelchair like it was proof we were crazy. The security guard asked us to leave while everyone stared. Samuel wheeled himself out without saying anything, and I followed, trying not to cry. During Samuel's physical therapy session, Marcus mentioned seeing Travis at the casino last weekend. He said Travis was with some young woman who definitely wasn't one of our kids, and they were using Joshua's credit card at the high roller tables. Marcus showed us a photo he'd taken because he thought we should know. Samuel just shrugged and said Travis's love life wasn't our problem, but I could see his hands shaking. The first court hearing arrived faster than expected. We walked into the courthouse and saw Travis wearing a suit that probably cost more than our mortgage payment. The kids sat behind him in a row and wouldn't look at us. When the judge asked for testimony, Katie stood up first. She described Samuel as creepy and controlling, and said we'd emotionally manipulated them their whole lives. Samuel rolled himself out of the courtroom before she finished, and I found him in the bathroom throwing up. The judge ordered family mediation 3 days later and told everyone to avoid contact until then. Within hours, the kids were texting us demands for money and calling us selfish when we didn't respond. Our lawyer screenshot everything and added it to our file. She said Travis was clearly coaching them, but proving it would take time. Samuel stopped eating regular meals after that hearing. I'd make dinner, and he'd push food around his plate before wheeling away. During physical therapy, Marcus pulled me aside and said Samuel was barely trying anymore. He warned that muscle atrophy would get worse if Samuel gave up on his exercises. I tried talking to Samuel, but he just said he was tired. One morning, we woke up to 4 flat tires on our car. The security camera showed someone in a hoodie, but I knew it was Joshua from how he walked. That specific way he favored his left leg from an old soccer injury. Samuel saw the footage too, but when I reached for my phone to call the police, he grabbed my hand. He said Joshua was still our son and we weren't calling the cops on him. I wanted to scream, but just called a tow truck instead. A month into the legal proceedings, Lila's med school called our house. The administrator said she was failing multiple classes and might lose her spot in the program. They wanted us to know since we were still her emergency contacts. Samuel immediately started planning how to help her, but I reminded him she chose Travis over us. He nodded, but spent the rest of the day staring at old photos of her white coat ceremony. That night, I couldn't sleep and went downstairs for water. I found Samuel at the kitchen table writing in a notebook. When he wheeled away to the bathroom, I looked at what he'd written. Letters to each kid describing their childhood memories and apologizing for things that weren't even his fault. The stack of unsent letters was already 2 inches thick. He'd been doing this every night while I slept. The next morning, my phone lit up with notifications from people I hadn't heard from in years. Travis had posted on Facebook about his stolen children and how we were rich abusers keeping them from their real family. The comments were already piling up with people who didn't know the whole story taking his side. My recovery sponsor called me within an hour, her voice tight with worry. story. She asked if I was okay, if I needed to come to a meeting, if I had any urges. I stared at the bottle of wine in the grocery store later that day for way too long. My hands were shaking when Mrs. Patterson, our neighbor who'd lived next door for 20 years, grabbed my arm by the frozen foods. She pulled out this little notebook from her purse and started flipping through pages covered in her neat handwriting. She'd been writing down every time Travis came by, what cars he drove, what time he left, even bits of conversations she heard through the fence. She told me she saw him yelling at the kids about money last week, and she was ready to tell anyone who'd listen what kind of father he really was. 3 days later, my phone rang at 2 a.m. Katie had been arrested at Nordstrom for trying to walk out with $3,000 worth of designer bags. The officer said Travis was listed as her emergency contact, but he told them to call us instead if we really loved her. Samuel was already transferring himself to his wheelchair before I even finished explaining. We drove to the station in silence and posted her bail at 4 a.m. She wouldn't look at us the whole ride home, just kept mumbling that Travis said the store never pressed charges if you took expensive stuff because of insurance. When I asked if she really believed that, she just stared out the window. Her hands were shaking, and I could see the moment it hit her that he'd set her up. She still wouldn't admit it though, just went to her old room and locked the door. That Thursday, Samuel had physical therapy with Marcus. I usually waited in the car, but something felt off, so I went in. Samuel couldn't do the basic arm exercises he'd mastered weeks ago. His hands kept shaking, and Marcus had to support him through movements a child could do. Marcus pulled me aside and said the stress was destroying Samuel's progress. He handed me a card for Dr. Rodriguez, said Samuel needed help he couldn't provide. The next week, I drove Samuel to Dr. Rodriguez's office. He tried to tell her about Father's Day, but couldn't get through it without his voice breaking. She had to stop the session twice because he was hyperventilating. She wrote him a prescription for anxiety medication and scheduled him for twice a week. He took the pills, but I could tell he thought they meant he was weak. 2 days later, Joshua's hospital called. Security footage showed him taking controlled substances from the medication room. He'd been suspended pending investigation and could lose his medical license. They said Travis had been calling the hospital claiming to be Joshua's lawyer, promising to handle everything. When they tried to reach Travis to confirm, his phone was disconnected. Joshua called us screaming that we'd ruined his life, that Travis had connections who could fix this if we hadn't cut them off. 2 months into all the legal stuff, we had to go to mediation. Travis showed up in a suit that didn't fit, coaching the kids to say we'd abused them, stolen their inheritance, turned them against their real family. The mediator, this older woman who'd clearly seen everything, just took notes while Travis ranted about his rights. When he finally stopped, she looked at him and said she'd be recommending the judge review his complete criminal history, including his current parole status. Travis went white. The kids looked confused. They didn't know he was on parole. That night, I couldn't find Samuel anywhere. Finally found him in the kitchen trying to crack eggs with one hand while balancing in his wheelchair. He'd burned the first batch of scrambled eggs but was trying again, determined to be useful somehow. He'd watched YouTube videos on cooking from a wheelchair, had notes written out, was measuring everything carefully. It was the first time I'd seen him trying to do something new since the accident. For 3 days, he practiced making breakfast. On the 4th day, Lila called sobbing so hard I could barely understand her. She'd been kicked out of med school, something about professionalism violations and missing mandatory sessions. She kept saying Travis promised his friend at the medical board could fix it, that he knew people who could make it go away. When I offered to help, to call the school, to hire a lawyer, she hung up on me. Samuel heard the whole thing from the kitchen where he was finally making perfect omelets. Marcus Williams knocked on our door that afternoon carrying a thick folder and looking mad as hell. He'd been Samuel's physical therapist for 6 months and had documented everything. The muscle loss charts, the pain scale recordings, the days Samuel couldn't even transfer himself from bed to wheelchair. Marcus spread the papers across our dining table and pointed at dates that matched when the kids stopped visiting. Marcus showing up with muscle loss charts and pain scales like the world's most caring detective. Nothing says I've got your back, quite like a physical therapist who moonlights as a record keeper with perfect timing. Samuel's progress had flatlined every single time they promised to come and didn't show. Marcus said he'd testify if we needed him to, and Samuel's eyes got wet. 3 days later, the pharmacy called about suspicious activity on Samuel's account. Someone had been filling prescriptions for oxycodone using his information at 4 different locations across town. The pharmacist showed us security footage of a skinny guy in a hoodie picking up the meds. We couldn't see his face, but I recognized Travis's walk from 20 years of watching him stumble around high. Samuel filed a police report, but without clear proof, it was just another dead end. 10 weeks into the court proceedings, Judge Winters finally reviewed Travis's full criminal record: 23 arrests, 6 convictions, 3 violations of parole. When the judge ordered a psychological evaluation, Travis stood up and started screaming about the system being rigged against him. He threw his water bottle at the court reporter and had to be restrained by 2 bailiffs. Joshua and Lila sat there looking at their phones while their dad got dragged out in handcuffs. The judge called a recess, and I saw Katie's hands shaking. That Thursday, Samuel found a support group for parents estranged from adult children at the community center. The room was full of people with the same broken look in their eyes. One woman talked about her son choosing drugs over family. A man described his daughter taking his retirement savings and disappearing. When it was Samuel's turn, he could barely get the words out about the wheelchair and the kids choosing Travis. Everyone nodded like they understood exactly what he meant. Saturday night, my phone exploded with texts from an unknown number. Katie had been dropped at the emergency room unconscious. The nurse said a man left her at the entrance and drove away before anyone could get his plate number. We rushed over and found her hooked to monitors with her stomach pumped. When she woke up, she was crying so hard she could barely breathe. She kept saying Travis gave her pills to help her relax about the court stuff, and she didn't know they were so strong. She'd only had 2 drinks at his place when everything went black. The doctor said if she'd arrived 10 minutes later, we'd be planning a funeral. While the nurses checked her vitals, Katie grabbed my hand and wouldn't let go. She told us Travis had been threatening to expose things from when they were teenagers if they didn't obey him. Joshua's shoplifting arrest that we got expunged. Lila's eating disorder that nearly killed her at 15. Katie's underage drinking citations from high school. He had copies of everything and said he'd post it all online if they didn't cut us off completely. Samuel wheeled closer to her bed and just held her other hand. She didn't pull away for the first time in months. His whole body relaxed like someone had lifted a weight off his chest. I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen since before the accident. The next morning, Travis showed up at the hospital with Joshua and Lila demanding Katie leave immediately. He started yelling about parental parental rights and tried to grab her IV line. Security arrived within seconds when he shoved a nurse into the wall. The whole thing was caught on 3 different cameras, including him threatening to kill us if we didn't release Katie to him. Joshua and Lila just stood there watching while their dad got tackled by security. The police arrested him for assault and he screamed the whole way to the patrol car. 3 months into all the court proceedings, Katie asked if she could stay with us while she recovered. She couldn't look at us when she asked, like she expected us to say no. Joshua and Lila texted her nonstop, calling her a traitor and saying she was dead to them. Travis had ordered them to cut her off completely and they obeyed without question. Katie would stare at her phone crying at their messages, but she stayed with us anyway. She started going to Samuel's physical therapy appointments with him. The therapist noticed Samuel pushing harder during exercises when Katie was there cheering him on. For the first time in months, he made it through the parallel bars without stopping. Marcus documented the improvement and said having Katie home had changed everything. Samuel could transfer himself faster and his pain scores dropped by half. Our lawyer called 3 days later with news that made Joshua throw up in our kitchen sink. The financial records showed Travis had been opening credit cards in Joshua's name for months, maxing them out on gambling sites and strip clubs, $50,000 worth of debt that Joshua knew nothing about until the collection notices started arriving at our house instead of Travis's motel. Joshua sat at our kitchen table staring at his credit report while his hands shook so bad he couldn't hold his coffee cup steady. Katie started seeing a therapist twice a week at the outpatient center downtown, and during her 3rd session, she finally talked about how Travis would show up with expensive gifts one day, then disappear for weeks, text her that he loved her more than life itself, then call her worthless when she didn't send him money, promise to be the dad she always wanted, then threaten to kill himself if she didn't obey. The therapist wrote pages of notes about textbook manipulation patterns and emotional abuse tactics, while Katie picked at the skin around her fingernails until they bled. 14 weeks into the legal proceedings, Mrs. Patterson from next door took the stand and pulled out a notebook where she documented every time she saw Travis at our house, every screaming match she heard through the walls, every time she watched the kids leave crying. The judge leaned forward as she read dates and times and direct quotes she'd written down, including the night Travis stood in our driveway yelling that he'd burn the house down if we didn't give him his kids back. Samuel started swimming therapy at the rehabilitation center, and the water helped him move in ways his legs couldn't manage on land anymore. Katie showed up one afternoon without telling anyone, and sat in the bleachers watching him do laps with the floating devices, cheering when he made it across the pool without stopping. The physical therapist said it was the first time Samuel smiled during a session in months. That Thursday night, Joshua called me screaming that Lila had locked herself in her apartment bathroom with a bottle of pills after Travis texted her she was worthless without med school, that she'd thrown her life away for nothing, that she was too stupid to be a real doctor anyway. Joshua kicked the door down and found her on the floor with a bottle in her hand, but she hadn't taken them yet, just sat there crying and shaking while he called 911. Travis called him 7 times while the ambulance was on the way, telling him not to involve us, to handle it themselves, that calling us would just make everything worse. Joshua called us anyway, and we met them at the emergency room where Joshua completely broke down in the waiting area, pulling out his phone to show us hundreds of texts from Travis. The messages showed Travis had been giving them Xanax and Klonopin mixed into drinks when they visited, telling them it would help with their anxiety about choosing sides, but really keeping them confused and compliant so they'd do whatever he wanted. The nurse who overheard called security and a social worker while Joshua scrolled through more messages, showing Travis teaching them how to doctor shop for more pills. Travis showed up at the hospital 2 hours later trying to sign Lila out against medical advice, claiming he was her father and had the right to take her home. I planted myself in front of her room door while Samuel called security from his wheelchair, and when Travis tried to push past me, I shoved him back hard enough that he stumbled into the wall. Security arrived within minutes and escorted him out while he screamed about parental rights and threatened to sue everyone in the building. The psychiatrist placed a 72-hour hold on Lila, and during her evaluation, she finally admitted Travis had naked photos of her that he'd taken when she was drunk at his motel and threatened to send them to her med school, her professors, and post them online if she didn't keep visiting him and giving him money. The detective who interviewed her said it was criminal blackmail and opened an investigation, while Lila sobbed so hard she threw up into a kidney dish. After she was released, all 3 kids moved back into our house temporarily. Nobody talking during meals, nobody making eye contact, just existing in the same space while Samuel cooked breakfast from his wheelchair every morning and they ate in silence. The tension was so thick you could barely breathe, but at least they were safe and Travis couldn't get to them without going through us first. 3 weeks later, at 3 in the morning, Travis showed up drunk in our front yard screaming about his kids, his rights, how we'd stolen them from him, how they belonged to him and he'd take them back one way or another. Samuel called 911 while I went outside with my phone recording, keeping Travis talking and ranting, asking him questions about why he needed the kids so bad, what his plans were for them. He was drunk enough to admit everything, slurring about how Joshua's credit was almost tapped out, how Lila had inheritance money from her grandmother he hadn't gotten yet, how Katie was pretty enough to make money in ways he didn't specify, but made my stomach turn. The sirens got louder and 2 cop cars pulled up with their lights flashing all crazy, while Travis kept yelling about how we'd ruined everything and the kids belonged with him. The officers got out and one of them recognized Travis from his parole file, which made him try to run, but he was too drunk and fell face first into our mailbox. Well, Travis really went for the gold medal in terrible life choices here. Pharmacy fraud, assault, blackmail, and ending his performance by face planting into a mailbox. Blood poured from his nose while they cuffed him, and I saw all 3 kids watching from the living room window with their faces pressed against the glass. The cops dragged Travis to the car and he kept screaming at the kids to remember who their real family was, but Joshua just stood there shaking his head. He didn't even ask if we were okay. Joshua said real quiet when I came back inside. The restraining order violation plus the public intoxication meant Travis went straight to county jail, and our lawyer Marcus started working on the bigger charges right away. 5 months of legal stuff followed with depositions and evidence gathering, and the kids having to relive everything Travis put them through. We started family therapy with this doctor named Rodriguez, who had us all sit in a circle that first session where nobody could look at each other. Samuel tried to talk, but his voice kept breaking, and the kids just stared at their shoes while tears ran down Katie's face. Week after week, we kept going back to that office, and slowly the kids started opening up about how Travis manipulated them and made them feel like they had no choice. Marcus filed criminal charges for fraud and identity theft and drug distribution, which got the federal prosecutor interested since Travis was already on parole. The prosecutor assigned to our case had dealt with Travis before and told us this was exactly the kind of violation that would send him back to federal prison for good. Katie had to testify before the medical board about how Travis forced Joshua to steal medications from the hospital, and she explained everything about the blackmail and threats. The board decided to suspend their judgment about Joshua's license until after the criminal case finished, which gave us some hope he might keep his career. Samuel's physical therapy started showing real progress around this time, and he got some feeling back in his left foot, which the doctor said was amazing considering his injuries. They told us the reduced stress was helping his body heal better, and I watched him work harder than ever at his exercises. 6 months after everything started, we had our first real family dinner where the kids actually helped cook instead of just showing up. Joshua asked Samuel about his therapy progress, and Samuel started crying happy tears while Katie held his hand. The awkwardness was still there, but at least they were trying to rebuild what Travis had destroyed. Then the trial date came, and we all had to go to the courthouse downtown, where Travis would face charges for everything he'd done. The kids were scared, but determined to tell the truth about how he'd controlled and threatened them for months. Samuel wheeled himself between them in the hallway outside the courtroom and held their hands while we waited to be called in. Joshua went first and had to describe all the financial stuff and how Travis made him steal drugs from the hospital supply room. He broke down on the stand explaining how Travis said he'd hurt Katie if Joshua didn't cooperate, and the jury looked really sympathetic. Travis's lawyer tried to make it seem like the kids were willing participants who just got caught and wanted to blame their dad. Lila stood up to him using all her medical knowledge to explain exactly how psychological manipulation works and why abuse victims often comply with their abusers. She stayed calm and professional even when the lawyer got aggressive, and the judge had to tell him to back off twice. Katie was the last one to testify, and she pulled out her phone with all the recordings she'd secretly made of Travis threatening them. The prosecutor played them for the jury, and you could hear Travis clearly saying he'd destroy their futures if they didn't keep giving him money. The defense lawyer objected, but the judge allowed the recordings as evidence since Katie recorded them in our house where she had every right to do it. The judge called for a recess right after that, and we all filed out into the hallway where Samuel wheeled over to each of the kids. He reached for Joshua first and pulled him down into a hug that Joshua didn't pull away from for once. Then he grabbed Lila's hand, and she actually bent down to hug him back while tears ran down her face. Katie was last, and she basically fell into his arms sobbing while he kept telling them how proud he was of their courage. The hug lasted way longer than any of us expected, and I saw other people in the hallway watching us with these soft looks on their faces. When court resumed the next day, Travis took the stand and dropped his biggest bomb yet. He pointed right at me and told the jury I was his drug partner 20 years ago and that I was the real criminal here. He twisted every detail of my recovery into some kind of weapon against us. Said I taught him how to cook meth and that I abandoned the kids first before he ever did. The prosecutor objected, but Travis kept going, saying he had proof from old police reports where my name showed up. My hands were shaking so bad Samuel had to hold them under the table while Travis painted me as some kind of mastermind who set him up. The judge finally made him stop talking, but the damage was done, and I could see some jury members looking at me different. 2 days later, it was my turn to take the stand, and I had to address every single lie Travis told. I admitted to the jury about my addiction 20 years ago, but explained how I got clean when the kids were babies, told them about every meeting I attended and every sponsor who helped me stay sober for 2 decades, showed them my 20-year chip from NA, and explained how Samuel was the one who helped our family heal. The prosecutor had me describe specific memories of Travis abandoning us while I was getting clean, how he chose dealing over diaper changes and prison over preschool graduations. Meanwhile, the kids were writing letters to the judge that we didn't even know about yet. Joshua wrote about how Samuel taught him to drive when Travis was locked up. Lila described every science fair Samuel attended while Travis was nowhere to be found. Katie wrote about the wheelchair and how Samuel lost his legs saving her from that drunk driver. They gave these letters to the prosecutor without telling us, and I only found out later when the prosecutor read parts during his next argument. Then came the real shock when the prosecutor revealed Travis had been running this exact same scam on another family in California. 3 kids he abandoned 20 years ago who he recently went back to asking for money. The prosecutor had their statements and bank records showing the same pattern of manipulation. The mom from California even flew in to testify about how Travis showed up after decades demanding cash. She described how he threatened her kids the same way he threatened ours when they stopped paying. The defense lawyer kept objecting, but the judge allowed it as evidence of pattern behavior. Dr. Rodriguez took the stand next as our family therapist and explained the trauma we'd all been through. She told the jury how Travis weaponized normal parent-child conflicts into tools of manipulation, described how he used the kids' natural desire for their bio dad's love against them. She had notes from our sessions showing how the kids went from confident to anxious after Travis came back. During lunch break at the courthouse cafeteria, an older couple came up to our table. They introduced themselves as Travis's parents who hadn't seen him in 30 years. His mom was crying as she apologized for what her son had become. His dad shook Samuel's hand and thanked us for protecting the kids from Travis. They said they'd tried to help him years ago, but he stole from them too and disappeared. 8 months into these proceedings, we finally got to closing arguments. The prosecutor painted Travis as a predator who specifically targets his own children for money. He showed the jury all the evidence, including the recordings and the California family's testimony. The defense tried arguing it was just manipulation, not actual crimes, but they couldn't counter all that evidence. The jury went to deliberate, and we had to wait 3 days for them to decide. During those 3 days, the kids came with us to Samuel's physical therapy session. He'd been working so hard to try standing with the parallel bars and leg braces. That day, he managed to stand for almost 30 seconds while the kids cheered him on. Marcus, the physical therapist, said family healing helps physical healing, and you could see Samuel trying harder with them there. Katie was recording it on her phone, and Joshua actually helped support Samuel's weight when he started to fall. When we got called back to court for the verdict, my stomach was in knots. The jury foreman stood up and read guilty on all counts of extortion and fraud. Travis jumped up screaming that the kids had betrayed him and they'd regret this, but the kids just held each other's hands and didn't say a word back to him. The judge sentenced him to 15 to 20 years and had the bailiffs drag him out still yelling. 2 weeks after the verdict, our house felt different, like someone had opened all the windows after years of stuffiness, but we were all scared to breathe breathe too hard. Samuel started cooking again for the first time in months, making his famous pasta sauce while Joshua helped chop vegetables without being asked, and Lila set the table with the good plates we hadn't used since before the accident. Katie folded napkins into those fancy shapes Samuel taught her when she was 12, and nobody talked about Travis or the trial or the money or anything heavy. We just moved around each other real careful like we were all made of glass. Joshua had to meet with the medical board the next week, and I drove him there because his hands were shaking too bad to hold the steering wheel. They made him wait 3 hours before calling him in, and when he came out his eyes were red, but he was smiling because they gave him probation instead of taking his license away since he was a victim too, and cooperated with everything. Joshua getting probation instead of losing his medical license makes me wonder if the board sees something in him that maybe even he doesn't see right now. Did they recognize a good doctor who got caught in something terrible, or are they just being careful because of all the victim testimony? He could go back to his residency with monitoring, but at least he could still be a doctor. Lila spent 2 days writing a letter to her med school dean explaining everything that happened with Travis and how she got manipulated and wanted another chance. The dean called her in for a meeting, and I waited in the parking lot for 2 hours until she came out crying happy tears because he said she could come back next semester. Katie surprised us all by announcing she was changing her major from business to social work because the therapist who helped her through the trial made her want to help other people going through hard stuff. Samuel offered to help her look at programs, and she actually said yes, and they spent the whole evening researching schools together. Then 3 weeks later, we got a call from the police saying they found a storage unit Travis had rented in Samuel's name 6 months ago. We had to go identify the contents, and when they opened that metal door, the smell hit us first, like old weed and chemicals. The whole unit was packed with stolen electronics, what looked like drug stuff, and boxes of credit cards with other people's names on them. The cops said Samuel was clear since the signature was obviously forged, but it was just another violation, another way Travis had used our family. The detective said Travis probably planned to frame Samuel if he ever got caught. By 10 months since this whole mess started, all 3 kids were in individual therapy working through their trauma in different ways. Joshua's therapist said he carried the most guilt about bringing Travis back into our lives and getting everyone else involved. Lila was working through her anger at herself for not seeing the manipulation sooner when she was supposed to be so smart. Katie blamed herself for Samuel's injury, even though he'd tell her every day it wasn't her fault he pushed her out of the way. Samuel hit a huge milestone in physical therapy when he transferred himself from his wheelchair to the car without any help for the first time. The kids had been secretly watching from the window and surprised him with a chocolate cake when he wheeled back inside, the first real celebration we'd had in almost a year. Then 8 months into Travis's sentence, a letter came from the prison addressed to the kids. I wanted to throw it away, but their family therapist said they should decide what to do with it together. They read it out loud in the session, and it was full of the same manipulation, saying they'd abandoned their real father and they'd regret it when he got out, and he knew people on the outside who would remember what they did to him. The kids brought the letter home, and we all went to the backyard where they built a little fire in the fire pit and dropped it in together, watching it turn to ash while holding hands. We ended up having to refinance the house to help pay off the debts Travis had run up in the kids' names because even though it was fraud, the credit card companies were being difficult, and the kids needed clean credit to move forward with their lives. Samuel insisted it wasn't about the money, but about giving them a fresh start, and when we told them the plan at dinner, all 3 of them started crying with relief. By 11 months since Samuel saved Katie from that drunk driver, our Sunday dinners had started feeling normal again, with everyone showing up without being reminded. Joshua would tell stories from his residency about funny patients, and Lila would complain about organic chemistry, while Katie talked about her social work classes, and Samuel would just sit there listening with this huge smile on his face because his kids were back. That next Sunday morning, Katie showed up early with Joshua and Lila, which was weird because they never came before noon, but they kept grinning at each other and told Samuel they needed him to come outside for something. He wheeled himself out to the driveway where this contractor truck was parked, and Marcus stepped out with blueprints in his hand, showing all these modifications they'd been planning for months. The kids had saved up their money from their jobs and worked with Marcus to install a wheelchair lift on the stairs and lower all the counters in the kitchen and put grab bars everywhere, and even built this amazing roll-in shower with a bench. Samuel just sat there staring at everything while they showed him how the new automatic door openers worked and the special desk they built so he could reach everything, and I watched tears rolling down his face as he kept touching each modification like he couldn't believe it was real. Katie hugged him and said they wanted him to feel at home in his own house, and Joshua explained how they'd researched everything to make sure it was exactly right, and Lila showed him the tablet mount they'd installed by his bed so he could read without holding anything. We were all crying by the time they finished the tour, and Samuel kept saying thank you over and over while the kids just held him. 3 days later, my phone rang at work, and it was our lawyer saying Travis had filed an appeal claiming his lawyer didn't defend him right, and the kids went pale when I told them at dinner. The lawyer said not to worry because the evidence was solid, but I saw Joshua's hands shaking, and Lila couldn't eat, and Katie kept checking her phone like she expected bad news any second. We spent the next 2 weeks jumping every time the phone rang, and the kids started sleeping at our house again because they were too scared to be alone, and Samuel tried to stay calm for them, but I caught him reading legal websites at 3 in the morning. Katie had to speak at this university thing about family trauma and manipulation, and she asked if we'd come, so Samuel and I sat in the front row watching her tell 300 students about choosing your real family. She talked about how blood doesn't mean love, and how Samuel taught her what a father really was, and when she said his name into that microphone calling him her dad, not her stepdad, the whole room could hear the pride in her voice. Samuel gripped my hand so tight I thought he'd break it, and afterward people kept coming up to shake his hand and tell him what an amazing father he must be, while Katie just beamed at him. 2 weeks later, the lawyer called to say the appeal got thrown out immediately because the judge said there was no merit to it, and Travis would serve every single day of his sentence. The kids didn't celebrate or cheer, they just sat there breathing like they'd been holding their breath for weeks, and Joshua finally said it's really over, and we all nodded. A whole year had passed since that drunk driver hit Samuel and Katie, and Joshua was back at his residency working these crazy hours, but every single night at 9:30, he'd call Samuel to talk about his cases. They'd discuss symptoms and treatments, and Samuel would look up research papers to help Joshua with difficult diagnoses, and I'd hear them laughing about funny patient stories until Joshua had to go back to work. Lila started started this support group at her medical school for students dealing with family trauma, and she put Samuel's picture on the flyer saying he was her inspiration for staying strong through everything. 20 students showed up to the first meeting, and Lila led them through exercises about setting boundaries and choosing healthy relationships, and she'd text Samuel after each session telling him how it went. During one of Samuel's physical therapy sessions, something crazy happened when the therapist was testing his reflexes, and Samuel suddenly said he could feel pressure on his left foot. The therapist kept poking different spots, and Samuel could feel about half of them, not enough to move anything but actual sensation after months of nothing, and Katie was there and they both started crying. The therapist said this was huge progress, and might mean more improvement over time, and Katie immediately called her siblings, who rushed over to celebrate with Samuel doing these little tests touching his legs, while he'd say yes or no if he felt it. The sentencing hearing for Travis finally came, and we all had to go to court where the kids would give victim impact statements about choosing Samuel as their real father. Travis sat there in his orange jumpsuit looking angry, while Joshua talked about how Samuel taught him to be a doctor, and Lila explained how Samuel showed her what real love looked like, and Katie described Samuel pushing her out of the way of that car. Travis didn't even look at them, just stared at the wall with this blank expression, like he didn't care what they were saying about the man who actually raised them. The judge listened to everything, then looked at Travis's record with all the drug dealing and the evidence about him trying to manipulate the kids for money and selling to minors in their apartment complex. She added 15 more years to his sentence for the drug distribution to minors, making it 25 years total, and Travis finally showed emotion, yelling that this wasn't fair, while the guards dragged him out. The kids wheeled Samuel out of the courthouse together with Joshua pushing, and the girls on each side holding Samuel's hands, and we all walked to the car in silence. When we got home, everyone just sat in the living room not talking. And finally Samuel said we survived, and the kids nodded, looking exhausted but unified like soldiers after a long war. The next morning, we all moved around the kitchen making breakfast, and nobody talked about what happened in court or mentioned Travis at all. Katie started planning her birthday coming up next month and asked if we could do something small with just us, and Samuel nodded while scrambling eggs. Joshua checked his phone and said his old coach from the wheelchair basketball league had been texting, asking when Samuel was coming back to practice. Samuel looked surprised since he'd quit months ago during all the chaos, but the kids immediately started saying he should go back, and Katie said she'd come to every game. Travis's grand plan to frame Samuel backfired so badly, he ended up with 25 years to think about how playing criminal mastermind worked out for him. Spoiler alert, not great. He agreed to text the coach back. Our family therapy with Dr. Rodriguez shifted that week from twice weekly crisis sessions to once a month check-ins, since we had the tools now and were actually using them. The sessions got shorter too because there wasn't much to work through anymore, just maintenance stuff. Time started moving differently after that, like we could finally breathe again. Months passed with normal problems like Joshua's car breaking down and Lila stressing about rotations and Katie picking a major. When Father's Day rolled around 14 months after everything started, the kids didn't plan anything fancy, just said they'd come for dinner at home, but they all showed up on time and stayed the whole meal and actually talked to Samuel about his basketball team and his physical therapy progress. Nobody looked at their phones once. Katie gave Samuel a card she'd made herself with pictures from when she was little, and he was teaching her to ride a bike. A few weeks later, Samuel was reading through college application materials when he found Katie's social work program admission essay titled Choosing Your Real Family, and it was all about him. She wrote about how he taught her what a father really was by showing up every single day even when it was hard. He got it framed and hung it next to her old dance recital photos in his office. Joshua came over that August with his girlfriend Sarah, who'd stuck by him through everything, and asked Samuel to be his best man at their wedding next spring. Samuel immediately said yes, and they started talking about how to modify the church for his wheelchair access. Lila got published in a medical journal that fall with an article about mental health in medical students dealing with family trauma, and dedicated it to my father Samuel Morrison, who taught me that resilience isn't about being unbreakable, but about choosing to heal. We started selling off some investments to create education funds for future grandchildren, and Samuel insisted they be called the Morrison Family Future Fund, with no mention of biology or genetics anywhere in the paperwork. Marcus finally discharged Samuel from physical therapy after 18 months, saying he'd reached maximum improvement and they'd actually become friends by then. Marcus invited him to help coach the Adaptive Sports League for other people with spinal injuries, and Samuel jumped at the chance to give back. That last Sunday dinner came 18 months after that horrible Father's Day when Travis first showed up. All three kids helped cook with Joshua manning the grill and the girls making sides while Samuel rolled around the kitchen directing traffic like he'd learned to do perfectly in his chair. We sat down to eat, and Joshua mentioned offhand that he'd heard Travis got transferred to maximum security after getting in a fight over gambling debts. Katie just said good and immediately changed the subject to her social work internship starting next month. Lila talked about her surgery rotation and how she was thinking about specializing in trauma care. Samuel caught my eye across the table and smiled that same smile from our wedding day 30 years ago. Because our family was scarred, sure, but we were whole. The doorbell rang just as we were clearing plates, and it was Mrs. Patterson from next door with a homemade apple pie saying she'd made too much and thought we might want some. Samuel wheeled over to the door and welcomed her in like he always did, and she joined our table for dessert, becoming part of our chosen family too, just like we'd all chosen each other. Thanks for letting me tag along for all of this. Hopefully my little observations got at least a smile or two out of you. Catch you later, friends. Subscribe for more content like this.